So in the last lecture, you learned how to replace a real implementation of a function with a mock function. In this lecture, we're going to continue with the technique that you learned in the last lecture, but then I'm going to show you a problem with this technique, and then you'll learn a better way to create mock functions. So in this lecture, we're going to work on this function, notify customer. Again, we use our database object. We get a customer from the database, and then we use another object, that's the mail object that we import from the mail module. We call the send method and send an email to this customer with this subject. So let's go ahead and write a unit test for this function. One more time, another describe block for notify customer function. Now, this function should send an email to the customer. So basically we need to call lib.notify customer, pass an order object. This order should have a customer ID because we're going to look up the customer with the given ID in this method. Now, before we call this, we need to replace the real implementation of getCustomerSync method of the database object. So back here, db.getCustomerSync, we set this to a new function that takes a customer ID, and here we return a customer object with this email. The actual email doesn't matter. As I told you before, it's better to use simple values as opposed to magic numbers or magic emails, because this reduces the confusion when someone else reads your code. So we have replaced the real implementation of this method. Now, similarly, we need to replace the real implementation of mail.send, because in our unit tests, we don't want to call a real mail server. Chances are that mail server is not up and running. We don't want our unit test to be flaky and slow. So back to our test file. On the top, let's import the mail module. So constant mail. We load this module. Now here's one thing you need to understand. When you require a module in Node, that module is loaded and then cached in memory. So if we load this mail module in 5 different places in our application, there will be a single instance of that module loaded in the memory. That's why this mail object that we get from this mail module is exactly the same mail object that is available in this lib module when we import the mail module. There is only a single instance in the memory. Okay, now back to our test. So we imported the mail module. Now we need to replace mail.send with a new function that takes an email and a message or subject. It doesn't really matter. Now, what should we add in the body of this function? Well, when we call lib.notify customer, we want to make sure that an email is sent to that customer. So here we can define a boolean like mail sent. Initially, we set this to false. And then in our mock function, we can set that to true. And later, we can expect that mail sent to be true. So if notify customer is implemented properly, at some point, mail.send should be called. And using this flag, we can determine if the mail is sent or not. So in essence, what we are testing here is the interaction of one object with another object. So back to our code. In this module, when we call notify customer, we want to make sure that this module interacts with this mail object properly. So we are testing the interaction of 2 objects. So back to our test. Let's save the changes. Now back in the terminal, you can see all tests are passing. Now, while this approach is perfectly fine for creating mock functions, there is a simpler and better way to create mock functions, and that's what I'm going to teach you in the next lecture.